Do insects think? That is almost an universal question, along with other similarly related topics. That was what Charles Henry Turner was wondering too in the late 1800s and early 1900s. By the end of his life, he had published 71 scientific papers, earned a doctorate magna cum laude from the University of Chicago, and proved, decades before the rest of science, that insects can think. Almost nobody has heard of him. Now, before you assume this is a meek story about a forgotten genius who was simply unlucky, consider the actual magnitude of things Turner actually proved. Because he demonstrated that cockroaches navigate mazes not by instinct but by memory, and that they retain what they learned even when you change the shape of the maze entirely. Similar to humans' pattern recognition. He argued in peer-reviewed journals that insects have something he called outcome awareness, an internal model of what should happen next, and the capacity to be surprised when it doesn't. The scientific establishment of his era believed insects were essentially biological machines, inputs and outputs, stimulus and response, without inner life, learning, or expectation. Turner read the same literature and thought they were wrong. He was right, and he proved it. Working without a university laboratory, without graduate students, without even a reliable research library, while teaching high school biology classes in St. Louis while the scientific world moved forward without him. Yet despite his incredible insights, he never got the recognition he deserved. Turner's papers were published. They were cited. Some of his contemporaries knew his work was important. And then, somehow, the field moved on without him, and researchers decades later essentially rediscovered findings that Turner had already documented and published. Some of the most celebrated conclusions in modern insect cognition research were wheels he had already built. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1867. Charles Henry Turner was born 2 years after the end of the Civil War in a city that liked to think of itself as progressive. His father was a church custodian. His mother had been enslaved before the war and worked afterward as a nurse. Turner grew up in a household where books were treated seriously, where reading was encouraged, and where the gap between what the world told you that you were and what you actually were was something you navigated daily. As a child, he collected things: ants, beetles, butterflies. He would catch them and study them with the focused attention that some children bring to stamps or trading cards, except that Turner was not cataloging specimens. He was watching behavior. He wanted to know what they were doing and why. This distinction between collecting a thing and watching it think would define the rest of his life. He was valedictorian of his graduating class at Woodward High School in 1886. He enrolled that same year at the University of Cincinnati, where he came under the influence of a biologist and comparative psychologist named Clarence Herrick. Herrick was the kind of mentor who actually changed trajectories. He recognized something in Turner that other professors at the time either couldn't see or didn't want to. Under Herrick's guidance, Turner completed an undergraduate thesis on the neuroanatomy of bird brains. A summary was published in the journal Science in 1891, making Turner the first African American to appear in that publication's pages. He was 24 years old. He stayed at Cincinnati for a master's degree, earned in 1892. Then the series of doors began to close. He taught at schools across the South over the following years, always continuing to write, always continuing to observe. He pursued a doctorate at the University of Chicago while simultaneously working as a teacher in Tennessee, somehow managing to finish the degree in 1907. He graduated magna cum laude. He was considered for a professorship at Chicago, but the professor who had supported his application died, and the replacement, according to W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote about Turner's life, refused to hire a black scientist. He was turned down at the Tuskegee Institute because Booker T. Washington reportedly could not afford both Turner and George Washington Carver. In 1908, Turner accepted a teaching position at Sumner High School in St. Louis, a segregated school for black students. He would stay there until his retirement in 1922. His salary that first year was $1,080. Here's what Turner did with that situation. He didn't stop. He taught full-time, managed a classroom every day, raised a family, and somehow, in the remaining hours, ran scientific experiments. He published 41 papers during his time at Sumner alone. His publication rate of roughly 2 papers per year exceeded that of most of his contemporaries working at fully funded universities. He used bees in his biology classes, not as specimens to pin to a board, but as demonstrations of complex behavior. His students watched live insects think. The question that set his most celebrated work in motion was deceptively simple. Everyone assumed that bees returned to a flower because of smell, or because of some automatic attraction to light and color. But Turner had watched bees long enough to notice something that didn't fit that explanation. They seemed to come back at the same time each day. Not approximately, actually the same time. He didn't know for certain whether this was real or whether he was seeing a pattern that wasn't there. So in 1908, he went to O'Fallon Park in North St. Louis with a notebook, a pencil, and a dozen small dishes filled with strawberry jam. He placed the dishes on picnic tables at 3 fixed times each day, morning, noon, and dusk. Bees found the jam. They came reliably to all 3 feedings. After several days of establishing this routine, Turner changed it. He removed the noon and dusk feedings entirely and offered jam only in the morning. At first, the bees kept showing up at all 3 times. They arrived at noon looking for a meal that wasn't there. They returned at dusk and found nothing. Within a few days, however, they stopped coming at the missing times. They adjusted. They appeared only in the morning, which is when the food now was. Turner concluded from this that bees perceive time and that they modify their behavior in response to changing conditions, not through some mechanical recalibration of instinct, but through something that functions like learning. They formed an expectation. That expectation was violated, and they updated it. This was not what anyone was supposed to be able to say about an insect in 1908. He then turned his attention to how bees navigate. He drove rows of wooden dowels into the park lawn. On each one, he fixed a small disc dipped in honey. The discs were red. Bees came. Once they were visiting reliably, he added new rods topped with blue discs that carried no honey at all. The bees largely ignored the blue discs, which meant they were distinguishing between them visually, using something other than smell to guide their approach from a distance. Around this same time, Turner observed burrowing bees leaving their nest holes and performing a specific circular flight before departing, a brief spiral upward and outward. He proposed that this flight was the bee forming a memory picture of the landmarks around its home. To test this, he modified the area around a nest entrance after a bee had left, placing artificial features similar to the original ones near a fake burrow. When the bee returned, it entered the decoy. The bee was using remembered landmarks, not smell or some inborn homing mechanism. It was navigating by memory. Carl von Frisch, the Austrian scientist who won a Nobel Prize in 1973, partly for his work on bee color vision and navigation, is the name most people associate with these discoveries. Turner had documented functionally similar findings years earlier. This is not to diminish von Frisch's work, which was careful and important. But Turner's priority in several of these observations is real, and it went largely unacknowledged for decades. The cockroach work is where Turner's methodology becomes particularly striking to a modern reader. He built an elevated maze out of copper strips supported by glass rods, the whole apparatus sitting in a pan of water to prevent escape. He ran individual cockroaches through the maze repeatedly over multiple sessions, recording how long each trial took, how many errors were made, and whether performance improved. It did. Cockroaches learned the maze. More remarkably, when he moved the trained cockroaches into a differently shaped maze, they retained their improved performance. They weren't simply memorizing a route, they had learned something more general about navigating novel environments. This is not the kind of research you expect from someone who has no laboratory, no assistants, and a full teaching schedule. Turner built his own apparatus, ran his own trials, recorded his own data, and wrote it up in papers that appeared in peer-reviewed journals including the Biological Bulletin and Psychological Bulletin. He was meticulous about controls in a way that was, honestly, ahead of the general standard of his era. He understood the importance of variables, of eliminating alternative explanations, of replicating observations rather than relying on a single striking result. Now, most people would have considered this body of work remarkable enough on its own, but Turner was also thinking about what it meant. His writing on animal behavior is full of a cognitive vocabulary that his contemporaries either avoided or rejected. He used the words learning and memory without embarrassment. He described insects as having expectations, as forming mental pictures, as acquiring meaning from experience. The dominant framework of the time held that insects operated purely by taxis and kinesis, reflex-like responses to stimuli, with no inner life to speak of. Turner read that framework and found it insufficient. He also wrote about prejudice. In one of his papers on comparative psychology, he argued that prejudice itself can be studied scientifically, that animals tend to be suspicious of animals unlike themselves, and that among humans differences in mind create more hostility than differences in appearance. He was not only studying the minds of insects, he was using what he learned about animal psychology to think about the thing that had constrained his entire career. He died in February 1923, 1 year after retiring from Sumner High School. The cause was myocarditis. He was 56. The clerk who filled out his death certificate listed his occupation as druggist. You would think that he would be classified as something like a biologist or a zoologist, some kind of scientist. But no druggist it is. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a short tribute to Turner in The Crisis in 1929. 6 years after his death, Du Bois described him as a man of genuine scientific ability who had been systematically denied the resources and recognition that his work deserved. The tribute is careful and respectful and a little heartbroken. The question Du Bois didn't quite ask, but which sits underneath every sentence, is the one that still doesn't have a satisfying answer. What might Turner have accomplished with a real laboratory, a real salary, and a university that actually wanted him there? The Animal Behavior Society now gives an annual award in Turner's name. His papers continue to be cited. In 2020, a paper in the journal Current Biology revisited his bee color vision experiments and concluded that he had been on the right track, even where his methods had fallen short. A 2021 review in Apodology described his work as anticipating fundamental concepts in animal cognition that the field would take decades to redevelop. What is especially admirable about Turner and his papers is how calm they are. There is no bitterness in them, no visible frustration at his circumstances. He describes his jam dishes and his copper mazes and his burrowing bees with the measured attention of a person who is genuinely, unshakably interested in what he is seeing. He was working from a park bench in St. Louis with a notebook and a pencil, and he was doing science that would have been significant at any institution in the world.